Okay, I think we are all mic'd up. That was a swift set change. I don't think you noticed. My name is Nicola Turner. I am Head of Access and Participation on Sector Practice at the Office for Students. What we know from the data is that the subject and institution that you choose has an influence on your outcomes when you graduate. But what we're holding under the spotlight with this particular panel is that your location and also your ability to be mobile also has a significant effect on your future earnings and your career prospects. And I don't think this has been that well recognised in the past. The Social Mobility Commission yesterday published their State of the Nation report, and it highlighted a clear earnings gap based on social class. Graduates on free school meals earn 11.5% less than others after 5 years following graduation. If you choose to study in your home region and not to move away to university, you will be today one of 45% of students. And what we know is that if you're young and you choose not to move either for study or when you finish away for a graduate job, you're going to be less likely to be in a graduate level job. Now, the Social Mobility Commission says that moving region is one of the routes to a better paid job. However, people from more affluent backgrounds are 70% more likely to move region than those from working class backgrounds to take advantage of that particular strategy. So why are some local graduates earning less? Why are they underutilised in some parts of the UK? Now, what we know is that demand for graduate skills is not spread evenly around the country. As a result of our regions having patchy productivity, if you graduate in a location where the graduate labour market is relatively quiet, then you may have a good degree and you may equally have had a good experience at your university. But if you want to stay local, then you're more likely to end up choosing a non-graduate level job. Higher education providers are highly influential in their locations. And what we want to know is what can be done to improve the individual prospects of students in our regions. Many of them are commuting to university and have a very different experience to those living on campus. And in our panel today, we're going to hear perspectives on this experience drawn from the data, drawn from research and the student voice. Now, this is very important to us at the OFS. So we have launched a £6 million competition to trial new approaches to improve the outcomes of local graduates. And when the local government elections are over and PERDA is complete, we're going to be able to announce the winners of our competition. And we're about to embark on some really interesting work that should support not only students, but also boost local economies. And that is a perfect way to introduce my speakers. So first of all, we have Charlie Ball, who is the Head of Higher Education Intelligence at Prospects and the Higher Education Careers Service Unit. We have Lord Kerslake, who is the Chair of the Civic Universities Committee and Chair of the Governors at Sheffield Hallam University. We have Professor Liz Thomas, an independent researcher and consultant and Professor of Education at Edge Hill University. And finally, probably needing no introduction from me, Shakira Martin, President of the NUS. Lord Kerslake, would you like to take the stand? Oh, I keep thinking my finger's going to clip out. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. And can I say first just how much I welcome an event like this? It does seem to me this is precisely the sort of thing that an active regulator should be doing. And for me personally, it's a relief to be not talking about Brexit for one morning anyway. I would also say that I very much support the new regulatory guidance and the bold new approach as it's been described to tackling the issues that we're talking about this morning, really raising social mobility and equality and diversity. It will make our lives more difficult, and so it should do, really, I think, in terms of universities. But it is absolutely consistent with what we sought to address through the Civic University Commission. Now, the subject of this last bit of the morning is local and commuter students. And I guess that's got less of a profile, perhaps less challenging than some of the other issues this morning, but I think no less important. Now, we know that so-called commuter students represent about 20 to 25% of the total student population. But they've been growing as a proportion. And in fact, if you go back to the early 80s, that figure would have been around 8%. So we've seen a fairly significant shift here. The distribution of commuter students, however, varies enormously by institution and by social group. So higher tariff universities have fewer. There are more in northern universities than in southern universities. Commuter students are more likely to be first generation in higher education, work part-time, have a state education, come from a lower income background, be mature students, come from an ethnic minority, or have caring responsibilities. In other words, commuter students are exactly in the groups that we're seeking to address in this event today. So it would be an oversimplification to talk about the notion of moving away from university being essentially English middle class and southern, and yet surprisingly it's become the dominant model really that we talk about. At Hallam, around 40% of our new entrants in 2017-18 were commuter students, and that's increased by 7% over 5 years. Over 3/4 are part-time students, 3/4 are mature students, and over half are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And they live pretty close, within 10 miles. We put a lot of effort into making them feel equal and welcome, both in terms of very practical things like signage and advance information, but also in terms of improving their social connections. So commuter students are better connected with their community, but less well connected with the university. So there's a lot that has been done, but a lot more that can be done. And the Sutton Trust, I think, rightly identified that there's a dearth of mechanisms to provide financial support for commuter students who often have a wide range of other responsibilities. And I think more recently, HEPI have talked about practical steps on things like local transport, where universities can step in and make a difference. I would like to say we have addressed all the issues at Hallam, but we haven't. We still have an attainment gap for those who are commuter students, and we have slightly, but nevertheless higher withdrawal rates. So whilst we've made progress on this agenda, I think there's more to be done. And I think arguably policy thinking and practice has not kept up with the rapid change towards more commuter students. So that's a bit about, if you like, the experience of so-called commuter students. What about the issue of outcomes? Well, I think, as has been touched on in the introduction, we have a major challenge about securing good employment outcomes. And for Hallam, those who stay locally for the university as a whole are over half. And for those who are commuter students, it's an even higher figure. So we do have a huge responsibility to ensure that we get good employment outcomes for our local students who stay locally. And for us, that means investing in a lot of effort so that all students on all courses have some form of work experience, for example. That is our ambition to deliver as part of our future mission. But we know we're working in a very challenging economic environment. This is, by some measure, the most unequal major country in the developed world in terms of spatial differences. And by the way, those differences are getting wider all the time. And that's why I'm doing a report in a couple of weeks' time that will set out the radical steps that need to be taken to rebalance the UK economy. But we can't wait for that, and therefore we have to work even harder with our local employers to get people into jobs. And in particular, we've got to form new partnerships where the maximum opportunities come to those who've trained and done their degree locally. In other words, a truly civic role for universities. Thank you.
Well done. And now, Charlie Ball, I invite you to take the podium.
Thank you very much. Right then. Oh, start badly. So, the late Tony Wilson, somebody I expect you weren't expecting to hear from today. The late Tony Wilson, the legendary factory records impresario, professional Mancunian and full-time controversialist, was very fond of coming to events like this in London and berating the audience with a metropolitan bias. In particular, he was extremely harsh on the idea that the most appealing route for a talented young northerner was to come to London, as it would demonstrate their ambition. In Wilson's view, any Mancunian who left their home city would only do so because they weren't good enough to get a job in Manchester. Won the room there, haven't I? Now, Wilson expressed his view in confrontational fashion, as was his wont, but his point is relevant to the modern graduate labour market. Nicola's touched on some of the data already. Most recent data we have on graduate outcomes show that about 4,500 graduates started their careers in Manchester. The large majority of graduates from Manchester went to work locally in Greater Manchester. The large majority of graduates, of course, will never move to London. And indeed, it's quite likely the majority of graduates never move significantly at all in their careers. Most graduates from 2017 went to work locally to their university, about 58%. 69% of graduates went to work locally to their original home domicile, and as Nicola mentioned, 45% never move at all. They go to their local institution and then they work locally on graduating. And so we need to get away from the idea that the typical experience for students is to move away, they look at a league table and move away to a university, and then they move away again in terms of employment. In fact, the most common experience for students is to go to their local institution and to work locally, and that has a profound effect on the way that students attain. It has a profound effect on the way that students are admitted into institutions, and a profound effect on the support that institutions need to offer to students and graduates. We all need to think locally. That's all I have to say now.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to invite Shakira to take the podium to tell us her experience. I'll clap for you.
Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here in one of the few of my last formal addresses to the sector. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about local and commuter students, because it's an important but sometimes often overlooked and forgotten topic. And because as a local student myself, this is one that is really close to my heart. As many of you will know, is that I've used my presidency to fight to ensure that everyone can get in and get on in further and higher education. My Poverty Commission report set out the barriers many faced. We included local and community, you know what I'm trying to say, students in that analysis. It's built on other work too. NUS has undertaken and we have published 2 reports on students who live at home with their parents and on the experiences of commuter students in recent careers. And the second part of the report is being written by Professor Thomas. And we took all the evidence and everything we've submitted to the Olga review. So whatever they recommend about commuter or local students was informed by evidence. And I know that they have looked at this closely. They just need to produce the report. That wasn't scripted. What our other evidence showed, as a sector, we need to do better if we want local students to participate fully in their educational experiences within their institutions. In higher education in particular, local commuter students are often forgotten about. The assumption is that students have moved away from home and the policies and practices of our institutions follow that assumption. For example, Commuter students tell us that a lot of their career development opportunities are scheduled in the evenings, which is either after they go home, do the housework, look after the kids or their carers, or having to stay on campus for several hours after. This can lead to them feeling stressed, less part of the community, and more likely to consider dropping out. Adding to barriers, the profile of local students is often different. We know that commuter students are often from poorer backgrounds, are from certain minority groups. They often have other caring roles, and they have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to support their family. For commuter students, time is precious. A local student, a parent, as a local student and a parent, I know too well the challenges of juggling caring responsibilities, coursework and extracurricular activities, all while dealing with the unrealistic transport and timetable, which means that I and students like me often can't engage in extracurricular activities. It can be so tiring, and that a common feeling amongst local and commuter students. But universities and colleges can fix their problem. I've got the sign up, and I said that I wasn't going to look at you, so I told you. But the last thing that I want to say is that as institutions, we can do a lot more about not only getting them in, but getting them on. And my challenge to you is about outcomes. How do we get them out into those good jobs, those good sectors, in those good industries? Thank you very much for your time.
And now, to close our panel, I'd like to invite Liz Thomas.
Thank you. There's a danger it turns into a clapathon. Thank you very much. I've undertaken some work for NUS, as Shakira just mentioned, and also currently working with London Higher, looking at students who commute in London. So talk to around about 100 commuter students through qualitative research. And what I want to say really is that the commuter students that we've talked to, and they may be the more engaged commuter students, have really high aspirations to achieve a good degree and to secure a graduate job. But as we've already heard, a lot of the outcomes are less good for commuter students, which may be connected to other aspects of their disadvantage, the intersection of disadvantage and so on and so forth. But also part of that is around their engagement in their higher education experience. The students we talked about prioritising their academic engagement in order to get a good degree. They said things like, I came to university to get a good degree, not to get a social life, and I'm happy just doing the work. But what they tend to do, therefore, is to deprioritise their engagement in the enrichment and enhancement activities, and also their social engagement, both that informal engagement and the more formal activities that are there. And that really then contributes negatively to their achievement of both their academic goals and their graduate employment. Students were quite positive about being commuter students. Some of them framed it as avoiding some of the distractions or excesses of a kind of stereotypical student life. But in fact, some of that sort of distancing due to circumstances of their interrelationships with friends and academic staff has a negative impact on their experience. So, for example, students talked about not being able to hang around at the end of lectures and therefore not to get some of that informal understanding about their independent learning and assessment activities. And then they couldn't chat with students to figure out what was required in their independent learning activities. They also said it's much more difficult to go to enhancement activities if you've got no one to go with. So you have that kind of ongoing disadvantage where you haven't got the circle of friends, and then you can't participate in those activities, and also it's more difficult to do so because they're in the evenings and so on and so forth. A student who cycled said you've either got to cycle in your business suit or you've got to carry it around all day, so in the end you end up not going to the networking event in the evening, and so on and so forth. So there's a range of things that we want to do, and I've clearly got no time in which to do it. But one of the things we must do is think about making commuter students visible. And we have to do that in part by giving them a voice in our institutions and challenge the dominant kind of discourse which comes from staff, which is that we should all be aspiring to a traditional university experience, the same as the one that we had, which was a residential experience, and rather start to recognise the real strength of those students who come from their local and regional communities, and actually employ them as our ambassadors going back into those regions and really give them a sense of pride and connection with their institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I'm going to invite some questions now from the floor. Do I have a starter? Anybody got a burning question? Okay, well maybe I will start you off and then you can join in. Liz, you talked about visibility and you were also talking about potentially the educational experience there. It would be great if you could, from your research, and the other panellists are welcome to join in, what can providers do to ensure the success of commuter students?
Okay. Talking to students about their academic experience is quite, at times is quite upsetting really. So students struggle to get into the institution. They often arrive hungry and late and stressed because of the stresses of travelling. And then they don't want to go into their academic session because it's already started. And so they end up either not going in, and Martha talked about this previously, about standing outside and listening rather than wanting to go in through the door. And some students even told us about being locked out of their lectures because allegedly for professional standards and sort of things. So I think we need to have more understanding about the realities of the commuter experience. We need to really look at the organisation of our curriculum. So looking at whether students are expected to come in every day or whether they can come in for blocks of time, and helping them to use that time when they're on campus. If you've got hours between your lectures, then sometimes you have to either study or spend money. You can't just there is no space to just kind of go and to be. So students talked about wanting places to leave their belongings or to heat up some food that they brought in from home rather than having to spend things on campus. We need to use their time strategically for their academic studying. So it's not just about giving content, but it's about applying learning. So much more a flipped classroom or active learning model. There's a lot of reluctance around academic colleagues to put, for example, things through lecture capture and things like that. But students talked about the fact that that's really useful to them and they should then be able to apply that learning in collaboration with peers and academic staff. So there's lots of different things, but I'm conscious of taking up too much time.
Bob, you mentioned briefly that Sheffield Hallam are doing quite a lot around supporting their commuter students. Do you want to tell the audience a bit about that?
2 or 3 points I wanted to make. First of all, as I said, we're on new entrants, we're at 40%, and it's risen by 7% in the last 5 years. So it doesn't take a great piece of arithmetic to see that we could be over half in not very long. And the question is that being reflected in the way in which the institution works and operates? And I do think a lot of it is practical things. So practical things for students to meet up. I've really, you might say this is too practical, but how good is the signposting, actually, which is a problem for every student, probably a problem for some of the people like myself who are involved in it as board members. But for those who are visiting, as students who are as commuters, they experience that as an even bigger problem. So it is a mix of messaging, do they feel equal and welcome, and very practical things about transport, space to study, signage, connections, timetabling of lectures and other events. It's a combination of the two, it seems to me. And an interesting question would be how much it comes through in the annual student voice report. I suspect not in many universities. So it's about reflecting, it's about the policy and the practice catching up with the reality, and I'm not sure it has. And those are just examples in Hallam of what we've done. There's more we've got to do as well.
Could I ask Shakira, from your perspective, what advice would you give to students who are trying to make this choice about not only where to study in terms of institution, but the location and how to manage their studies?
I think it's really difficult. It's about taking that first bold step to know that you're going to be less off before you get to somewhere where you can kind of progress. But I'm really happy that we're talking about why can't I say that word? Students who live at home. But also what I would say is that we need to stretch a bit deeper, because students who live at home live at different types of homes and in different environments. So for example, myself, I moved out at 16. I had my own social housing by the time I was 17. Even if I wanted to move to go to university, I never had that option because I would have to uproot my whole home and move, and my children. So that is a no-no even now. Even as national president, having that social capital to go anywhere, I still can't uproot my whole family, my whole children, and move out of my social housing into a temporary accommodation and try and get back into London. That's not going to happen. But it's about blended learning. Education is changing. How can we use blended learning and really understand the different needs of students? We're using the digital space as well. Facebook is a great example of how we can feel part of a community and know what's going on, but not even be in that space. So I think we need to really use digital and blended learning, but really truly understand the different needs of commuter students, because if we just look at it as a blanket, we're still failing them, because it's deeper than just the little title, students living at home.
Thank you. We have a question here. I have a mic.
Thank you. Sol Jarvis, University of Hertfordshire, and thank you, Shakira, for teeing up my question absolutely perfectly, because it was about the commuting students versus live-at-home students. And one of the things that we are wrestling with at the University of Hertfordshire is what is our definition. So students who have always been local to the university, or wherever they are and travelling in, versus students who may have uprooted their household and moved not into halls but further away. So they are commuting students, but they're not live-at-home students in quite the same way. And I just wondered what the panel were doing in terms of definitions of commuting students or live-at-home students.
I think that's part of the challenge, isn't it? That in a sense it's a really broad concept, and we've already heard how it intersects with a whole range of other kind of categories or ways of defining students. And so when we went and did the initial piece of research, institutions started looking at postcodes and comparing home postcodes and term time postcodes. A few other institutions had kind of more sophisticated ideas. The work I've been doing in London is actually challenging that, which is probably relevant to you, in the sense that the majority of students commute. And then what they're starting to be able to see is a relationship between the time it takes to commute and then the contribution or impact on retention. So that's an interesting piece of work that institutions have done, and seeing that up to a certain point, the longer you commute, the more likely you are to leave early. And then actually it seems to plateau out and actually improve. So students are perhaps making a more informed decision rather than at all not realising quite what it involves to make that longer commute. But I think therefore some of the strategies in some institutions are actually about all those students who can't just pop back to a hall of residence. But I think there's a question we haven't explored about what the contribution is of living with other students and an environment in which it's understood what higher education study is and what it requires, versus those who go back to a family potentially, whether that's their own family and children or their own parents, who don't really understand what it is that they're needing to do, and looking at the number of timetabled hours and saying, well, you don't need to be in then. I mean, students that I've spoken to have sort of colluded with academic staff to tell families about kind of fantasy sessions that they have to attend just to give them that space to study, and that's clearly not what we want to be doing. So I think we need to do a lot more work around definition, and probably we need to segment our commuter student population. But I think it does provide that useful lens to start having conversations with students about what their issues are.
Charlie, obviously you did a lot of data analysis in this area. How do you cut and categorise these student groups?
Well, I mean, Liz has highlighted some of the major issues in exactly defining these groups, particularly as when we get admissions data, or when we get data from the point of entry of people into the university system. We often don't know a great deal about their previous experiences, where they've lived, where they've originally had work or study. But I think at root, and one of the crucial questions here is we're still treating this whole group of students as if they are edge or unusual cases.
That's the point.
And then they're not. They are now the typical experience for many university student bodies, and as Bob has highlighted for his institution and for many others, they are going to be the norm. And so this is the kind of conversation we need to have urgently right now, so that we can understand a great deal more about what our student body is going to look like in the future, because this is what it's going to look like, and universities are not set up for it at the moment.
Yeah, I think in addition to defining what actually the definition is, I think we need to institutions need to really understand how their existing policies stretch out. So for example, we talk about sexual harassment on campus. For community students, this might not happen on a Monday to Friday between 9 and 5 o'clock, but on a Sunday evening at 2 o'clock. What responsibilities do institutions have in playing that role with community students? And I think when we look at, I really embrace the sector in thinking differently, and the OFS has really, since they've come, really start to put different things on the agenda, but I still feel that we truly don't really understand what is it that we're looking at. It's not just the academic bit, it's about the social bit as well. Mental health. If you're not spending time around a person, you're not going to necessarily be able to pick up those little signs about well-being and mental health. How are your policies stretching beyond just your student population as students, but really identifying the diversity of students who live at home? Because I'm not going to try and say that word again, I don't know, it's tongue-piercing, I think. But yeah, and I think that's really important. There are commuter students that are being sexually harassed, that are suffering from mental health, and they are being forgotten about because you're not seeing it as the institution.
Just one last point to make, which is that on the data I've seen, there's more commuter students in urban areas than rural areas, but I think the challenges in rural areas are even bigger actually. Transport is an absolute nightmare. And I think, so those who have universities in rural areas, I think have to specifically look at that dimension as well. It's a different kettle of fish if you live within 10 miles of Sheffield, if you like, to it is going to essentially a rurally based university.
Oh, we've stimulated.
Yeah, so Imogen Butler, Cabinet Office. I was wondering what work had been undertaken talking to commuter students or even through the universities themselves about the possibility of sort of personalising timetables. I'm very aware that in America you can select your modules and pick which days you kind of want to be in, whereas my understanding is still in the UK we kind of operate on an approach of we will tell you when your lectures are and you should be there, which I think is quite challenging, but I'd like to know what you have done.
I'm aware of some practice. I think the lady from Hertfordshire here might have something to say about that, but I'm aware that you can choose to do morning or afternoon lectures in some universities because they are particularly aware that their students will have fixed working patterns, for example. But that's not possible in every university, and I think, you know, anyone who is working on stacked timetables, or I'd be really interested in hearing from you after this event. Does the panel have any experience?
I know Sunderland had done some work around allowing students to kind of engage directly with the timetabling office so that they could choose things around seminars and that sort of thing. So they were already blocking the timetable on each course so that students would know in advance that they were in sort of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday or something like that. And then there was an element of choice. I think there were some challenges around that. But I mean, other institutions that have played around with personalised timetables have run into some problems, because then if they don't meet student expectations, that's potentially worse if you've told them that they will have a personalised timetable and then it doesn't meet their needs. So that can be quite difficult too. I don't think we're set up for it for all sorts of good and bad reasons.
You've picked something there that we need to know more about. Another question.
Thank you. Joshua Sanson-Kirk from the University of Law Student Association. I completely agree with Professor Thomas about the sort of the importance of enhancement activities and extracurricular things outside of the academics curriculum. Where do you think the line lies between selling those things to commuter students, but also not putting too much pressure on them so they do begin to suffer because of the stress of not being able to turn up to certain things? Where do you think that line lies?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to probably educate all students around some of the benefits. So students would say they wanted a good degree and a good job, but then would deprioritise some of those activities that would be the differentiating factors when there was a stack of people or applicants with good degrees and so on and so forth. So I think all students need that, but I think we need to look much more about how we integrate that into their curricular experience. So there's really good evidence around placements and those kind of activities contributing and levelling up the difference between students from more disadvantaged and more privileged backgrounds. So I don't think we want to make it stressful, but I do think we need to think again about the organisation and the offer that we make to students and actually take some of that responsibility ourselves rather than trying to make students kind of fit, you know, round pegs and square holes and that kind of thing.
I think it's also about helping them connect up with each other. So I think it's about networks that may be as valuable as saying, come to this or that social event, it seems to me. Building the networks is really important.
Thank you. There's another question there from our board member, Martin.
Martin Coleman, I'm Deputy Chair of the Office for Students. A lot of the regulatory system and the structure of the system as a whole is predicated on the idea of students having choices in terms of institutions. And mobile students do have choices, at least geographically they do. There may be other restrictions on choice. Commuter students, almost by definition, have either no choice or much more limited choice of institution. So league tables, for example, are of little value to you as a student if you really have only got a choice of one or two institutions anywhere. How far does the panel think that the regulatory system and the culture and organisation of the sector as a whole needs to take more account of the fact that there are now a very significant proportion of commuter students with limited choices within the system?
Charlie?
That sounds a bit like a leading question to me, Martin. And of course the answer is the system needs to take a great deal more of account into that. One of the things that I keep hearing, one of the things that we've heard throughout this whole session is that a graduate is looking for a good job. And of course, if you're a young person from the traditional student background, the home counties background, perhaps second, third generation university, a child of accountants, you're going to a Russell Group institution where they have a very good accountancy degree, and you get a job as an accountant just like your parents, then you're a success and have got a good job. Whereas if you're a first generation student from a very tough part of the country, let's say my old neck of the woods in Wigan, and you go to your local institution and you get a permanent job in Wigan that is not considered graduate level employment, then you are a failure. Is that really fair? Is that really appropriate? Is that really how the student sees it? And the answer to all of those three questions is certainly arguably. Now, of course, we've got an issue that the university system takes a certain degree of public money, and the public wants to see a return on that investment. But at the same time, if we're saying that student choice is at the heart of the system, then we have to understand that some students are making choices or have limited choices, and we're not really taking account of that in terms of the regulatory framework or in terms of the way that we measure outcomes.
I'm going to invite Bob to speak, but I would just like to say what we're hearing from graduates is that they know they could move to take a graduate level job, but their preference and their choice is to stay local by their families for whatever reason. And so we shouldn't be actually laying a judgment on top of that choice, but we tend to be.
Can I give an example actually before Bob comes
yes,
in?
sorry.
So, and I appreciate, I'm now going to invoke Scotland, which is a country to the north of here that isn't covered by the Office for Students. And there's a very good researcher in Scotland working in careers employability called Rosie Alexander, and she works primarily with students from Orkney and Shetland. And her students go largely to the local institution, the University of Highlands and Islands. And they say that they go to the University of Highlands and Islands in order to learn to be mobile. And what they take from that mobility is the option to be mobile, which they very rarely then exercise. They normally go back home to Orkney and Shetland and they seek success as getting a decent, full-time, permanent position in Orkney and Shetland. And that's an experience that is actually surprisingly common in England as well.
Thank you, Bob.
Two quick points really on this question of policy catch-up or practice catch-up. I think my background has been in housing actually for a long time, and I'll just give you a parallel really. For the large part of the last 20 years, the focus has been on home ownership. Under people's noses almost, in terms of policy making, the number of people in private rented sector has doubled. Policy is now scrambling to catch up with the realities of where people live now as opposed to where they used to live. That's been a change that has happened in the last 10, 20 years. And I think this is another example of how fast does policy thinking, practice thinking, move with the realities of the change that's going on here. And I think there is some work to do for institutions and nationally. Just on this point about jobs and testing people, I get the point that not everybody will go to university with an ambition to move into a higher skilled job, but I don't think that absolves us from the responsibility of maximising their opportunities. And what I was really saying is I'd love to see the economy rebalanced. It's going to take quite a long time to do it. In the meantime, we have a double responsibility as universities in less economically productive places to make sure those opportunities are there. Do you see what I mean? I think I would worry if we kind of consoled ourselves by saying it's okay because people didn't get into high-skilled jobs because they didn't really want to. I know you're not saying that, but we have a double responsibility, it seems to me, in those areas that are less economically active to make a difference, I guess, is the point.
Quick, do you want to make a quick response to that, or should we go straight to Shakira?
I think Bob's made the point. It's not a question of people not wanting to get higher skilled roles. It's people have individuals having different priorities about what they want to get. As we know from the current social and economic climate, people's personal identities are very important to them. And I'm not sure that as a sector we should be telling people whose personal identities are rooted in communities that the way to success is for them to leave those communities.
But just one last point on this. The study that I will be publishing in a couple of weeks' time shows that the UK economy has decoupled. There'd always been a theory of trickle down. London and the South East does well, and therefore the rest of the country does well. That has stopped happening in the UK economy. Our projections are that if nothing else changes, well over half the new jobs will go to London and the South East. Wow. So we can't, we have a big problem here in this country that we've got to tackle, I guess.
Shakira.
I think it was a really good question. I think we need to have an honest conversation, the difference between free will and choice. Because actually we don't have choices because choices have already been made. There's options based on those choices. So it's like me saying to my children, do you want a fruit, a banana or an apple? You can't have a kiwi because I've already made that choice of the fruit that you can have. So it's really, we need to really check what we're saying when we're saying choices, because sometimes we just say words, we know what we think we mean, but actually choices have already been made. It's options. And I think we need to be clear about that. But the work of what we need to do about students living at home is it needs to be embedded over our overall strategy in every single part of our institutions and across our institutions. But we need to recognise and realise when we're having double standards. So we can't be working with partnerships in procurements and having tenders and saying we're about productivity, investing in people, but yet your commuter students has to travel 3 hours to get here, but we know that is not productive. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. Like, how can we, though, use these commuter students, what they're going through and the barriers that they're going through, and turn them into employability skills that are recognised? So the fact that you can get in, come in, multitask, that shows that you can problem solve. That shows that you can work, prioritise workload. How can we change that into something that's transferable, that employers can see as a recognised skill through their barriers? I'm almost finished, 1 minute. Timetabling. These things ain't a new subject. Muslim students have been talking about timetabling during Ramadan, like how are we going to be more accommodating. Jewish students have been talking about, Fridays is their days of prayers. This ain't work we shouldn't be. This isn't a subject that we should be just starting at level 1. You should already be at least level 2 already, because students have been talking about this already. So again, I just need to say to you, it's good that we're talking about it, but are we really understanding what we're talking about, or are we just trying to think differently but not really thinking deeper? This needs to be embedded across our strategy, and there's already work that's being done. How can we leverage? Pull levers. I hear that in the sector all the time. How can you pull levers and make sure that different departments can see that they're achieving their outcomes through understanding the overall strategy? We're started, but we've still got a long way to go.
Okay, time for one last quick question. Is there a question? Okay, I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the panel. We've touched on patchy productivity. Does anyone have, I mean, Charlie, I know you've done a lot of work on different parts of the country. Yeah. Do you want to, with a minute and 20 seconds, say anything at all about parts of the country that need particular attention?
Transport.
Great.
There you go.
Sorted. The rural came up, didn't it?
Yeah, and
Coastal is another big thing.
I haven't got time for my 2-hour discussion on rural students and the way that they're not really accommodated for. But yeah, essentially transport links, good transport links. Sheffield is a city that knows well the issues with not having outstanding transport links with other parts of the country. And if we had better transport, particularly in the north of England, it would make a real difference to the opportunities that are available to people working and studying and the options that they have.
Thank you very much. Any final comments from my panel before we close?
Just a plea really to follow up on the previous question, which was how can we build that kind of recognition that students who don't move away to study are also more likely to study to work locally into things like our indicator data. So, for example, the Leo data will start to take into account the geography, but also how do you take into account the student intake, that they're less mobile, and we have to be thinking about that. That has to be part of our consideration of employment outcomes for institutions in our data.
Thank you very much. Could you join me in thanking my panel? Thank you very much.